Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. My name is Arafat, and today I would like to discuss should Muslim accept historical criticism. This is a very important discussion in my opinion, because historical criticism is basically how one does history, or at least how a historian does history. Basically, in a nutshell, historical criticism basically is historians or scholars of history would have a text, okay, the primary text that they found, and then they would put it under scrutiny as much as possible. And this will be difficult if a Muslim were to do historical criticism on the Prophet Muhammad SAW or even the Quran. So there must be a certain way whereby we say that okay, we can only do historical criticism to a certain extent. But would that actually be a good way to look at things? Now, obviously, as a Muslim, we will not apply historical criticism to the Quran, because the Quran is the revelation from God, and people who came out with historical criticism themselves, majority of them, not all, majority of them actually do not believe in God. But if you look at it, how one does history is standard across all board. Like for example, if you want to know the figure Julius Caesar, then you'll have to go back to the sources that we have on Julius Caesar. The more independent sources that we have from one another, the better. But if we only have a few sources that are not independent of one another, then we find the primary source, and then we go from there. So the same can be said about the Prophet Muhammad SAW. There are many sources of early, there are many early Islamic sources like Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, Imam Al-Waqidi, for example. Those are the three primary sources that a lot of Muslim historians will actually go to, as well as what hadiths and things like that says. But the hadith were only canonized completely, majority of them. Okay, Muwatta Imam Malik was earlier, but again, our manuscripts do not date back to as early as that. But Bukhari was revealed, or not was revealed, was compiled, was canon, was written. Imam Bukhari, he wrote his Sahih in about 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad SAW. Even though he traced back the chain of narration, it is not as authentic as possible. But again, we do not have the earliest manuscripts of Bukhari. We do not have the original manuscripts of Bukhari. So how do we know if Bukhari have been carefully copied and things like that? But then again, this sort of things is not really a few errors in the copying mistakes, or any copying mistakes doesn't really matter, because we have the Sita. Okay, we have the 6 authentic book of hadiths, or sorry, 2 authentic book of hadiths, and the other 4 contains a lot of authentic narrations, and so they are independent of one another. But not with regards to Bukhari and Muslim, because Muslim was a student of Imam Bukhari, and so we know that even if one report or any one isnad is there's a break in the chain of narrations, we can take it from another independently attested report, and we can also say that okay, this event is historical. And if we compare that to Christianity, it doesn't exist to that amount of level or degree. For example, like our gospel, our earliest gospels, complete gospels, came from Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which is about the year 375 CE of the Common Era, and that is about 350 years also after Jesus and Paul even. And so the sources for the Christian, the dating for the Christian sources is much later to that of the Islamic sources. At least we do have Quran from the 7th century, although it is the Birmingham Quran can be dated to around the year 650, but that is based on the carbon dating, radiocarbon dating, not of the ink, but of the parchment, the materials that they use. It is possible that the Quran could have been written later, but majority of historians, based on the radiocarbon dating, would put it to around 560 to 650, within 90 years also. But obviously the Quran must have been written from the year six after the life of Rasulullah SAW, because that is not the complete copy of the Quran. And we know that the earlier Quran was written on back of leaves and things like that. But Uthman radiallahu anh, he codified the Quran, and he produced about 4 different copies of the Mus'haf. Each contain varying readings. This is what scholars say, like Ahmad Ali, for example, and Mustafa Azami. And so we do not have that level of scrutiny compared to all the other ancient sources. Period. Julius Caesar, our earliest manuscripts, if I'm not mistaken, around the 10th or 9th century. Julius Caesar obviously wrote his own book, his biography, autobiography. But the manuscripts of Plato all came much later, about 1,000 or 2,000 years, even 1,000 years. My mistake, 1,000 years, at least 1,000 years. And so this is far dated compared to the historical figure themselves when they live or when they roam this earth. And so if Muslims do not accept historical criticism, then they must be consistent and apply that to all the historical figures that we have. And basically we raise our hands and say that we don't know, because we do not have the original sources. That means we cannot know for certain what the authors wrote. And even if we have the original sources of the authors, if the authors wrote centuries away from the historical figure that they are writing about, how do we know that they are actually writing what the historical figure really is, or who the historical figure really was? And so there's no way for us to know. And so what we have is educated guesses. Philostratus could have been right about Polonius of Theana, for example. But again, we do not have access to history. Same, our sources, our early sources for the Prophet Muhammad SAW contains contradictory sources, and this is what scholars themselves have been saying. And so if there lies in it contradictory sources, which obviously we do have contradictory sources in our early sources with regards to Prophet Muhammad SAW. So how do we know who the Prophet really was? Obviously we know that he's a prophet. Okay, no one can deny that, because our sources are. This is a strong evidence. The Quran is the evidence as well. But suppose we leave the Quran aside. Okay, so how do we know that the Prophet is a historical figure and that he claimed what many Muslims today claim and things like that? Now, obviously, when we read the Sirah does not contain the same level of reverence compared to the Quran and the Hadiths. Okay, the Hadiths and the Sunnah, they're synonymous. They're being used to explain certain passages of the Quran, or to clarify certain passages of the Quran. You cannot read the Quran without going through the book of Hadiths, and if you were to do that, then you are interpreting things that the companions or the Prophet himself might not have narrated to us what the verse could actually mean. And so if we have the Sirah, in my opinion, should contain historical scrutiny. Anyone who wrote the Sirah, they should look at all the primary sources that we have, and then we should put it under the same historical scrutiny when we are writing about Jesus, the historical Jesus, when we are writing about Julius Caesar, for example, Plato, Socrates. Socrates, we depend on the sources of Plato, Aristotle, even we apply this to the Veda, the Upanishad, the sources that claim Buddha and things like that. So we have to look at all the historical figure and apply the same methodology so that we are consistent in the way we do and look at history. Now, this is the academic route. Suppose Muslims today do not accept the academic route. Okay, that is, they do not accept historical criticism. And then they believe that historical criticism is basically someone from 2000 or 1400 years after, okay, and then they try to look back, and then they believe that this is what the historical figure really was. Whereas when we have Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, they were all early, very, very early, 200 years also. They were very early, okay, and so they must have access, or they must know better about the Prophet and things like that. Now, this goes both ways. This is partly true and also partly untrue, because if they know the Prophet exactly, and if they know the Prophet is someone who does a lot of things, and then they narrate it faithfully, then we should not have contradictions in our early Islamic sources with regards to the life of the Prophet. The reason that we do have contradictory reports, this should open up the door for us to actually apply historical criticism. There is not a figure in the history, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, that doesn't have any contradictions in their report. Unless there's only one report that we have, like Julius Caesar, for example, since he wrote his autobiography, and so we can trust in a sense, but that is if we have the original manuscripts of him. But the fact that we don't, and it has been copied and copied and copied, so how do we know if the copying have been done faithfully? The same can be applied to the life of Rasulullah SAW. If Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq, if they have independent sources, then we should know. But the fact that we don't know that they use any other independent sources besides they go and research and actually write what the Prophet Muhammad SAW really could have been. And so this is a question that we do need to think carefully. First and foremost, I accept historical criticism. I do not reject historical criticism, and I apply it standard across all boards. I apply it to the Islamic literature, I apply it to the Jewish literature, and I also apply it to the Christian literature, because we have to be fair and consistent. And because we have contradictory accounts, if there is a contradiction and in fact we do have contradictions, then it could either mean a few things. Both accounts cannot be accurate because they're contradictory. So either one of them could be accurate and the other one could be false. But then again, how do we know? And so we do have to apply historicity. We have to apply the methods of how anyone does history today. And so it is very important, because we do want to know the real Muhammad SAW. if we leave the Quran aside, because the non-Muslims will not believe in the Quran, but if non-Muslims want to know about Muhammad SAW, and so we should encourage them. As a Muslim, we should encourage them to know about the Prophet SAW. And we do want to present the Prophet SAW in as much accuracy as possible, not by brushing aside any accounts that we don't like. That is, if we do that, we are basically reading what we want. We are projecting the image of what we want the Prophet to be. It might not necessarily be the Prophet, the man, Rasulullah SAW himself, and what he might actually have been. And so we have to be careful. We do not want to be anachronistic, and we do not want to understand the Prophet in light of modern experience. Because the Prophet was living in 7th century Arabia, and his subjective experience back then is completely different than us today. Even if we live in 20th century Arabia, it is completely different. Ancient people and modern people are not the same. And so we have to be careful not to project what we want the Prophet to be. Rather, we should dig out the rubble of history, apply historical criticism, standardize it across all boards, and then we should actually let the sources guide us to the conclusion. Because I believe this is one of the ways that we can actually uncover who the Prophet as a man, as a figure of history, he really was. Now, our sources that we have, all the sources that we have, cannot reveal us the real Muhammad SAW. That is because we no longer have him with us today. We have thousands of reports about him, thousands of reports, and majority of the hadiths that we have in the Sittah are sound when it comes to the chain of transmission. And even then, so we cannot really say that we know the real Prophet really was, who the real Prophet really was. Now again, I'm saying this, if we remove the Quran, if we leave aside the Quran, okay, because we are not going to apply historical criticism to the Quran, because the Quran is the primary book of Islam, and any religion in the world is not based on anything more but faith. And so if we are trying to look at this from a neutral perspective, because a Muslim faith and a Christian faith and a Jewish faith is completely different. The Christian will say the Quran is not the book of God, and then the Muslim will say the same for the Bible, the complete Bible. And the Jews will not accept the New Testament and the Quran. And so we are trying to look at it from a neutral perspective. We're trying to present the figure Muhammad SAW from a neutral perspective, so that it can be accepted by the Jews and the Christians. Because if we use the Quran to describe Muhammad SAW, the Jews and the Christians will not accept the Quran as a source. And so if we remove as much as possible quote-unquote religious source, then it will be more palatable for people of other faith to read about the historical Muhammad SAW. I think this is the best way that modern scholarship can evolve. If we look at majority of the Sirah written, they're written from a faith perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it'll be interesting to know the man Muhammad SAW, after having gone through historical criticism of all the early primary sources. And in my opinion, in my limited amount of things that I've researched, you actually uncover the historical figure Muhammad SAW, somewhat different than what uh, the old books of Sirah have actually mentioned about him. Now, whether this new historical figure Muhammad SAW, after we have applied historical criticism to the primary sources and things like that, can we now say that we really have the accurate Muhammad SAW? The answer is still no, because like I've said earlier, we do not have access to the man. The man lives 1400 years ago. Um, and so if we have the man today, we can write books about him based on what we see. And we can also have reports written about him based on what he spoke. And that is what the Sahaba did. And so as far as our historical source are concerned, our primary source are concerned, if we really have a strong source, that is Muslim would say that is the hadiths, again leaving the Quran aside, the hadiths is no doubt a very strong source about the narrations of the Prophet, about what he does, how he does things, how did he conduct himself in the battles and things like that. We can actually leave aside the Quran and actually just read and understand or know more about the Prophet based on the hadith, and that is what early Islamic scholars have done. Because if we read the Quran, we hardly find narrations about narrations that we can see that actually help us understand the man Muhammad SAW. In fact, we know more about Moses and Jesus in the Quran than about Muhammad SAW. And this might be puzzling to Muslims, but the fact is, just go through the Quran and actually try to find and see how much can you learn about Muhammad SAW, and compare that to the hadiths. We will know more about Muhammad SAW based on his character, his akhlaq, his adab, and things like that, basically from the hadiths. And so leaving aside the Quran should not be something that should not be something controversial. Okay, in fact, what we have in the Quran is repeated in the hadiths as well when it comes to knowing about Muhammad SAW. And so we do not actually need the Quran to reconstruct the historical figure Muhammad SAW. Again, there are no works currently out there in the market about this. There are no works. The last work was written by Karen Armstrong. I think it was in 1990s. In the 90s, a revision of it came out in the year 2001. But we do need Sirah produced by Oxford University. We do need Sirah produced by Cambridge University, by University of California Press. We do need by Harvard even, University of Edinburgh in Scotland. I have their Islamic series in my humble shelf. But then again, we do not have the biography of the Prophet ﷺ. And I'm not sure why, partly because people are not interested, or academics are not interested in writing about him. I'm not talking about brief excerpts about him. I'm talking about a complete seerah dedicated to him, with references, with biography, using the primary text and apply historical criticism to that. We do not have it currently. It has never been written. And so it'll be interesting to see within the next few decades or so who came up with this work. Obviously, it's going to be a massive task, and that person would definitely need support financially and things like that, because he'll definitely need to scramble across all uh, the world, all over the world, or at least in Arabia, to find authentic manuscripts, like primary manuscripts that we have, the earliest copy of manuscripts that we have, and then start again and actually go from there, and not just depend on secondary sources or primary sources that have been copied and produced or quoted in some other books. I'm talking about actually someone who goes through the land and like goes through scramble through the libraries and things like that to actually look back at the earliest copy of the manuscripts that we have, be it Bukhari, be it Muslim, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, be it Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, Imam al-Waqidi, all these primary sources that we have. We do need someone to actually uh, go back and read the manuscripts and not just depend on books or translations or and things like that, or prints by Darussalam and things like that. We actually need someone to go through if they have access to. Um, Again, it's not easy to have access to all these sources. Um, as Tim McIntosh Smith would say in his book Arabs 3,000 Year History, it's not easy to have all these primary sources available to one. Um, but then again, the scholar who undertake this work will definitely not be able to teach in university. They would definitely need to spend at least 5 years or so in Arabia, going through visiting the historical sites, try to look at historical sites and try to actually read if the report is actually historical. If they need to go through the archaeological site, they need to go through the books of archaeology, what have been written by German scholars in the Enlightenment. All the way until now, they need to take a look at all these texts and all these sources. But I believe this will be a very fruitful um, publication. Again, there is nothing today of that pedigree. Yeah, and so it'll be interesting to see if there's any works published, especially Oxford. Oxford needs to come out with this. Oxford and Cambridge, they're two of the leading universities in the world when it comes to many studies. But the fact that they do not have um, is very, I don't know. Maybe they are doing it. I don't know. But it'll be very interesting to see um, if there is ever such works produced. So um, till then, till next time. My name is Arfat, and I'll see you on my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.